Welcome to Karen Stories. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell to never miss a crazy story. Let's dive in.
The words hit me like a slap to the face, sharp and final. We've decided to restructure the client relations department. Ruth, today will be your last day. I stared across the conference room table at Dominic Hayes, the man who had slithered his way into Franklin and Associates just 8 months ago and was now sitting in Arthur Franklin's chair, as though it had always belonged to him. He looked at me with that cold, practiced expression, corporate regret blended with just the right amount of detached professionalism, as if my entire career, 25 years of loyalty and labor, was nothing more than a footnote in his latest cost-cutting initiative. My throat was tight, but my voice was steady when I spoke. After 25 years, business decisions aren't personal. He slid a manila folder across the polished table, the severance package, 2 months' salary and continuation of benefits through the quarter, a pitiful send-off for someone who had built this firm from the ground up, someone who had been here when Franklin and Associates was nothing but a scrappy consulting firm trying to carve out a name in Boston's ruthless corporate landscape. Janice from HR sat beside him, nodding sympathetically while avoiding my gaze. The restructuring affects several departments, she added, her voice laced with carefully rehearsed concern. This isn't a reflection on your performance. Wasn't it, though? At 58, I was the oldest in my department, my salary reflective of my experience. Experience that had retained clients worth millions. Experience that had once made Franklin and Associates irreplaceable. But now, in the new world of slick corporate efficiency, I was considered dead weight. Does Arthur know about this? I asked, cutting through the false pleasantries. Dominic's jaw tightened. All partners were consulted on restructuring decisions. A calculated non-answer. Arthur had been in London for 3 weeks, handling our European expansion. I knew him, knew the way he worked. He never would have approved this. Not like this. Best of luck in your future endeavors, Dominic concluded with a smile that never reached his eyes. Security will escort you to clear out your desk. Standard protocol. Protocol I had helped write 12 years ago. The security guard stood awkwardly beside my desk as I packed my things. A framed photo with Arthur from my 20th work anniversary. A collection of thank you notes from clients. The crystal paperweight Arthur had gifted me when we landed our first multi-million-dollar client. My phone buzzed. A text from Catherine Winters, CEO of Winters Healthcare, our largest account. Ruth, heard troubling rumors about changes at F&A. Our quarterly review is next week. Call me ASAP. I looked up. Across the glass walls of his office, Dominic was already on the phone, no doubt spinning damage control. He thought relationships could be transferred in a memo, reassigned in a spreadsheet. But trust wasn't a commodity. It wasn't something you could cut and paste. And Franklin and Associates had just severed me from 25 years of cultivated trust. Their mistake. I left without a word, head high, but inside, I was burning. 3 days later, my LinkedIn profile was flooded with messages. Clients, competitors, headhunters. We Should Talk knew this firm was going downhill the moment Dominic took over. Tell me you're starting your own company, and I'm in. I ignored most of them. My mind was still tangled in the bitter sting of betrayal. But then, my landline rang. A rare occurrence these days. I almost let it go to voicemail until I saw the number. Arthur, I just landed from London, he said, his familiar British accent tighter than usual. And I heard the news. A complicated mix of relief, anger, and hurt crashed over me. Well, it happened regardless, I replied coolly. Dominic said all partners were consulted. Arthur exhaled sharply. They waited until I was overseas. The executive committee pushed it through on an emergency approval basis, said it was necessary to improve quarterly projections before our investor meeting. Investor meeting. That was all that mattered now. Not loyalty, not relationships, just the numbers on a spreadsheet. 25 years, Arthur, I said, my voice softer now, but edged with something darker. I deserved better than a 10-minute meeting and a security escort. You deserved much better. There was a pause. I want to make this right. What if I bring you back? We can call it a misunderstanding. I let out a bitter laugh. Dominic made it clear I was considered expendable. Legacy fat, I believe were his words. Silence. The kind that stretched deep, saying more than words ever could. Look, he said finally, his voice careful. There are things happening that you should know about. Can we meet? Curiosity flared, but I wasn't ready to give him the satisfaction of easy forgiveness. I'll think about it. By the end of that day, I had received calls from 11 major clients. Not one of them had reached out to Franklin and Associates first. They had come straight to me. Dominic thought he had won. He thought he had wiped me off the board like a dispensable piece. But he had miscalculated. He had underestimated the weight of 25 years of trust, and he had no idea the reckoning that was coming. Arthur was waiting for me when I arrived at the Harvest, a quiet, upscale bistro tucked away from the corporate chaos of downtown Boston. He looked older than I remembered, the weight of something pressing into his shoulders, etching deeper lines into his face. As I slid into the seat across from him, he exhaled, almost like he had been holding his breath. You actually came! I folded my hands on the table, studying him. Curiosity got the better of me. Arthur nodded, signaling the waiter for a drink. Then, I won't waste your time. The firm is in trouble, Ruth. I let out a slow, measured breath. I know. No, I don't think you do, he said, leaning in, his voice hushed. Dominic has been consolidating power for months. He made sure I was overseas before pushing your termination through. He's convincing the board that we need to shift away from legacy relationships and focus on aggressive growth strategies. Arthur's lips curled in disgust. Since you left, 5 major clients have issued complaints about the transition. Catherine Winters is demanding a formal review. Douglas from Archer Pharmaceuticals won't return my calls. And last night, Westridge Manufacturing announced they're reviewing their options with outside firms. I knew it was bad, but I didn't realize it was unraveling this fast. You should have fought harder, Arthur, I said, my voice sharp but even. You should have stopped him before it got this far. He swallowed, looking genuinely regretful. I thought I had more control than I did. I underestimated him. I leaned back in my chair. And now what? You want me to clean up your mess? Arthur hesitated, then exhaled. Come back. I'll make you an equity partner, give you full control over client relations. We can stabilize the firm before it's too late. It was everything I had ever wanted. A seat at the table I had spent decades earning. Recognition. Power. But it was too late. The damage was done. And Arthur didn't just want me back, he wanted me to save him. I picked up my glass, swirling the liquid absently. Dominic made a mistake when he let me go. But you made a bigger one, Arthur. You let him. Arthur's face paled. Ruth. I set my glass down gently, tapping my fingers against the rim. I've had offers. Blackwell Consulting reached out this morning. So did Whitmore and Grant. They see the value I bring. The value you failed to protect. Arthur's hands clenched into fists. You can't seriously be considering going to a competitor. I gave him a slow, knowing smile. Why not? Business decisions aren't personal, right? His mouth tightened. He understood now. The same words Dominic had used to discard me were now being turned against him. You don't have to do this, Ruth, he said, his voice quieter now. I can fix this. I can get rid of Dominic. We can take back control together. The problem isn't just Dominic, I said, standing. It's you. You let the culture of this firm rot. You stood by while he gutted everything we built. And now you want me to come back and pretend it never happened? I shook my head, slipping my coat over my shoulders. I'm not interested in salvaging a sinking ship, Arthur. I'm interested in taking the helm of a better one. As I turned to leave, Arthur called after me. Ruth, if you walk away, this firm might not survive. I paused at the door, glancing back. I know. Then I walked out. By the next morning, I had officially accepted Blackwell Consulting's offer. The deal? A senior partner position, full control over client strategy, and something even more valuable, equity. By noon, word had spread. My phone was ringing off the hook. Former colleagues, old industry connections, even competitors who wanted to congratulate me while fishing for inside information. But the most interesting calls came from clients. Not just Catherine Winters, but Douglas from Archer, Belinda from Summit Financial, the executive team at Westridge Manufacturing. The message was the same. They were considering moving their business, not to Franklin and Associates, to me. I hadn't asked for it. I hadn't needed to. Dominic had underestimated me. He thought by cutting me loose, he was severing my influence. Instead, he had given me something far more powerful, leverage. Franklin and Associates thought they had removed an obstacle. Instead, they had just lit the match that would burn them down. A week later, I got another call from Arthur. His voice was tense, bordering on desperate. The board just held an emergency meeting, he said. Dominic is out. They want you back. I smiled, settling back into my chair at my new Blackwell office, overlooking the Boston skyline. Arthur, you're missing the point. What point? He asked, frustration thick in his voice. I let the silence hang, letting him feel the weight of it before I answered. I don't need Franklin and Associates anymore, but they need me. His sharp inhale was all the confirmation I needed. I had won, and they had no idea just how much worse it was about to get. Arthur's silence stretched across the line like a chasm, deep and irreversible. I had won, and we both knew it. He exhaled sharply, trying to regain some semblance of control. Ruth, you're making a mistake. I let out a soft laugh, shaking my head as I stared out over the city from my new office at Blackwell. No, Arthur, the mistake was yours. I hung up before he could argue. For 25 years, I had devoted my life to Franklin and Associates. I had built their relationships, secured their biggest accounts, protected their reputation like it was my own. And in the span of a 10-minute meeting, they had discarded me like I was nothing. But now they were drowning, and I was the only one who could save them. I had no intention of doing so. The final nail in Franklin and Associates' coffin came 2 days later, when Catherine Winters made the call that would change everything. I had been expecting it, waiting for it. The slow collapse of Franklin had been playing out like a well-rehearsed tragedy, and now the crescendo was here. Ruth. Catherine's voice was crisp, cutting through the silence of my office. I'm pulling Winters Healthcare's contract from Franklin. I let my lips curve into a slow smile, though I kept my voice neutral. I'm sorry to hear that. No, you're not, she said, amused. And neither am I. I leaned back in my chair, watching the Boston skyline bathed in the soft glow of evening. So, where are you taking your business? She chuckled. Where do you think? There it was. The moment Franklin and Associates could no longer recover from. Winters Healthcare had been their biggest client, the backbone of their annual revenue. Losing them wasn't just a financial blow, it was a death sentence. I assume Blackwell is prepared to onboard us immediately? She asked. I had already been working with my new team for days, preparing for this exact moment. Of course. Good, she said. Send me the contracts. By the time I ended the call, I knew Franklin's days were numbered. And Dominic's? He was already gone. But now, I was about to make sure he never got back up. News spread fast. Too fast. By the end of the week, 6 more clients had announced their departures from Franklin. By the end of the month, that number had climbed to 13. The headlines wrote themselves. Franklin and Associates faces mass exodus of clients. Once prominent firm teeters on the brink of collapse. Industry giant Franklin and Associates in freefall. What went wrong? The articles painted a bleak picture, and I devoured every word. Dominic was nowhere to be seen. After the board had unceremoniously thrown him out, he had gone silent, his once prominent LinkedIn page stripped down to nothing, his name disappearing from the industry almost overnight. Arthur, on the other hand, was desperately trying to salvage what little remained. He had made public statements, pledging to regain client trust, vowing to bring Franklin back from the edge. It was too late. My competitors, were circling like vultures, eager to devour whatever was left. But I had already claimed the best parts, the most valuable accounts, the strongest relationships, the very foundation Franklin had been built on. It was mine now. And Franklin and Associates? It was nothing but a crumbling shell. 2 months later, I received one final call from Arthur. I almost didn't answer. Almost. But curiosity won out. His voice was hoarse, exhausted. Ruth. I remained silent, letting him struggle to find the words. He cleared his throat, his breath unsteady. I wanted to say congratulations. I raised an eyebrow, even though he couldn't see me. For what? A bitter laugh. For winning. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my desk. Is that what this was? A game? He sighed. You know what I mean. I did. Franklin and Associates was finished. The official closure had been announced that morning. What remained of their assets had been acquired, their office space leased out, their names struck from the industry's memory. And me? I was still standing, stronger, smarter, and in control. What happens now? Arthur asked quietly. I tilted my head, considering. You'll land somewhere. You always do. And you? I smiled. I think I'll be just fine. Another pause. Then, softer, I should have fought harder for you. Yes, you should have. He let out a slow, tired breath. Goodbye, Ruth. I didn't say it back. Instead, I ended the call, leaning back in my chair and staring out over the city I had once ruled from the shadows. Now, I ruled it in the light, and there was no one left to challenge me. The headlines faded. The murmurs died down. Franklin and Associates was a relic of the past, reduced to nothing more than a cautionary tale in business school lectures and industry gossip. The firm that had once been my entire world was now just another failed enterprise, swallowed by greed and miscalculation. And yet, I wasn't done. Not yet. Because one final piece remained. Dominic Hayes. While Franklin and Associates had crumbled into irrelevance, Dominic had retreated into the shadows, licking his wounds. He hadn't resurfaced in the industry. No new job, no strategic comeback. He had disappeared, as if the ground had opened up beneath him. But I knew better. Men like Dominic didn't vanish. They regrouped, they schemed, they plotted their next ascent. I wasn't going to let that happen. It started with a single tip, a whisper from an old connection in private equity. Dominic was in negotiations to buy into a mid-sized consulting firm, Camden and Rice, a struggling company with potential, desperate enough to take on an investor with deep pockets and a questionable past. I did my homework. Camden and Rice had a decent reputation, but had been hemorrhaging clients after a series of poor leadership decisions. Their CEO, Elliot Camden, was a risk-taker, someone who believed in comebacks and second chances. Dominic had sold him a dream, a revitalized firm, leaner, meaner, primed for aggressive expansion. It was almost laughable how predictable he was. He thought he could rebuild, thought the first wouldn't notice, thought he could worm his way back into power and start again. He was wrong. The night before the deal was set to close, I arranged a meeting with Elliot Camden. It wasn't hard. People were always willing to take a meeting with me now. Power had a way of opening doors. We met at a private club, the kind of place where men like Camden felt most comfortable making decisions that would shape their futures. He greeted me with polite curiosity, but I could see the calculations behind his eyes. This is an unexpected surprise, Ruth, he said, signaling for a drink. I assume this isn't a social call? I smiled. No, Elliot. It's business. He nodded, waiting. I understand you're bringing in Dominic Hayes as a partner, I said, watching him closely, and that you're preparing to finalize the deal tomorrow. His expression didn't change, but his fingers twitched against his glass. That's confidential. I leaned forward slightly. It won't be by morning. His jaw tightened. Are you threatening me? Not at all, I said smoothly. I'm informing you. Because if you move forward with this deal, you won't just inherit his money. You'll inherit his mistakes. And I don't think you want that. Camden exhaled sharply, shifting in his seat. He told me Franklin's collapse was out of his control, that it was politics, boardroom battles. Did he tell you he engineered my firing? I asked, tilting my head. That he stripped the firm of its strongest client relationships and left it bleeding out for months? That the reason Franklin collapsed wasn't some unfortunate turn of events, but because Dominic made it his personal mission to gut it from the inside? Camden was silent. I pressed on. Did he also tell you that he was nearly under investigation for misrepresentation of client data? That his aggressive cost-cutting measures nearly resulted in a breach of contract lawsuits? I paused. Or that several of his former employees have gone on record about the toxic work culture he fostered? Camden's face darkened. I had my doubts, he admitted. But I didn't have any hard evidence. I reached into my bag and slid a folder across the table. Now you do. He hesitated, then opened it. Inside were meticulously compiled reports, testimonies, and financial red flags that I had quietly collected over the past month. Not just on Franklin's demise, but on Dominic himself. Camden flipped through the pages, his expression tightening with each revelation. Jesus, he muttered. I knew there were risks, but I didn't realize that you were about to hand over your company to a parasite? I supplied helpfully. He shut the folder, rubbing a hand over his face. Why are you doing this, Ruth? I smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Because Dominic Hayes doesn't deserve a second chance. And I don't believe in unfinished business. Camden studied me for a long moment, then nodded slowly. I'll make the call tonight. The fallout was immediate. By the time Dominic arrived for what he thought was his final meeting, the doors were closed to him. Camden and Rice publicly withdrew the deal, citing strategic concerns. But that was just the beginning. Word spread fast in our world. One failed comeback attempt could be written off as bad luck. Two, that was a death sentence. Within days, Dominic became persona non grata in the industry. No firm wanted to touch him. No investors wanted to take the risk. He had been labeled what he truly was, a liability. For weeks, I waited for him to reach out, to call me, to rage, to plead, to fight. He never did. Instead, he disappeared entirely. His name faded from the conversations, his presence erased from the industry. And for the first time in my career, I felt it the true weight of victory. I had done more than destroy Franklin and Associates. I had buried Dominic Hayes so deep. He would never claw his way back. One evening, as I stood in my office, gazing out over the city, my assistant knocked lightly. There's a man downstairs asking to see you, she said hesitantly. He won't give his name. I already knew who it was. For a brief moment, I considered it. Considered giving him 5 minutes. Considered letting him plead his case, listening to whatever pathetic excuse he had to offer. Then, I shook my head. Tell security to escort him out. She nodded and disappeared down the hall. I turned back to the window, watching the lights flicker across the skyline. It was over. Dominic had tried to erase me, to cast me aside like I was nothing. But in the end, I was the one who erased him. And I never looked back. The past has a way of haunting the ones who refuse to stay buried. For months, I thought I had erased Dominic Hayes. His name had vanished from industry conversations. His failed comeback attempt at Camden and Rice had sealed his fate. The doors he once walked through with ease were now bolted shut, his reputation a smoldering ruin. No firm would touch him. No investor would risk their capital on a man whose last venture had imploded with such spectacular failure. I should have felt satisfied, victorious, and I did, until the invitation arrived. A thick ivory envelope, embossed in silver, slipped beneath my office door after hours. No sender, no return address, just my name, centered in elegant calligraphic script. Inside, an invitation to the Landon Executive Summit, a prestigious annual gathering of industry leaders, top executives, and influential power players. The kind of event where careers were made or broken over quiet conversations in dimly lit lounges. And at the bottom, listed under the keynote speakers, was a name I had not expected to see again. Dominic Hayes. I arrived at the Landon Summit in a tailored black dress, the kind that spoke of quiet dominance. My presence alone sent a ripple through the room. People whispered, side-glanced, assessed. I knew what they were thinking. She's the one who brought down Franklin and Associates, the one who buried Dominic Hayes. I accepted the unspoken acknowledgement with a small smile, sipping my champagne, eyes scanning the crowd. The summit was a battlefield disguised as a networking event. Alliances were forged here, deals were brokered in whispers, and somewhere in this room, Dominic was waiting. I spotted him near the far end of the room, speaking with a group of men I recognized as mid-tier investors. He looked different, leaner, his suit sharper but ill-fitting on someone who had lost the easy arrogance that once defined him. He laughed at something, but the sound was hollow. A man grasping for relevance. He hadn't seen me yet. Good. I watched as he leaned in to shake hands with an investor. I knew well, Samuel Langford, one of the sharpest deal-makers in the business. Samuel's firm had considered investing in Blackwell Consulting months ago, but had backed off, citing timing concerns. If Dominic had managed to get a meeting with him, it meant one thing: he was trying to resurrect himself, and he was doing it fast. I moved before I could talk myself out of it, my heels clicking against the marble floor as I approached. Dominic caught sight of me just as I stepped beside Samuel, his face draining of color for a fraction of a second before he forced a smile. "Ruth," he greeted, voice even. "Dominic," I returned, keeping my tone neutral, unreadable. Samuel glanced between us, his curiosity piqued. "I assume you two know each other?" Dominic chuckled, forcing an air of familiarity. "We go way back." I met his gaze and let the silence stretch between us just long enough for discomfort to settle in. Then I turned to Samuel. "What are you and Dominic discussing?" Samuel raised an eyebrow, amused by my directness. "He's making an interesting proposal. A new firm, agile and disruptive. He's positioning himself as the next big thing." Dominic smirked, regaining a sliver of his confidence. "That's right. The industry is shifting. The old ways of client relations? They're dead. It's about automation, about streamlining. Efficiency over sentimentality." I tilted my head, feigning curiosity. "Automation?" He nodded. "That's where the future is heading. AI-driven analytics, automated client engagement systems. We don't need the old models anymore." I smiled, slow and deliberate. "So, you're saying relationships are obsolete?" His jaw tightened, sensing the trap too late. Samuel chuckled. "That's an interesting take, considering your history, Dominic." I took a delicate sip of my drink before continuing. "The last time you dismissed client relationships, Franklin and Associates collapsed. And now you're selling the same model?" Dominic's smile faltered. Just a flicker, but I caught it. I pressed forward. "Tell me, Dominic, how many investors have actually committed? How many of them are willing to tie their money to a man whose last firm imploded under his watch?" Silence. He knew I already had the answer. Samuel shifted, adjusting his cuffs. "That's a fair point," he mused, eyeing Dominic with renewed skepticism. Dominic's composure cracked. "Business evolves, Ruth. I'm adapting." I leaned in slightly, lowering my voice so only he could hear. "You're drowning." His nostrils flared, his fingers curling into fists at his sides. For a moment, I thought he might lash out, say something reckless, something desperate. But he didn't, because he knew he had lost. Samuel cleared his throat. "I think I'll hold off on any commitments for now," he said, stepping back. "Ruth, always a pleasure." I nodded, watching as Dominic's last chance walked away. When I turned back to him, the mask had slipped completely. Gone was the smooth, strategic operator. In his place was a man who had gambled everything and lost. I didn't say anything else. There was nothing left to say. I turned, my heels clicking against the marble as I walked away, leaving Dominic standing there, stripped of whatever illusion he had tried to build for himself. He was finished. And this time, there would be no resurrection. I left Dominic standing in the middle of the Landon summit, his future crumbling like dust beneath his feet. For a moment, I thought that was the end of it, that I had extinguished the last ember of his ambition, that I would never have to hear his name whispered in the halls of power again. But I should have known better. Men like Dominic don't go quietly. It started subtly at first, a rumor here, a vague mention there. A few of my usual contacts in private equity started dodging my calls. A couple of well-placed whispers in the industry hinted at doubts surrounding my leadership at Blackwell. Nothing obvious, nothing direct, just enough smoke to make people wonder if there was fire. It wasn't long before I found the source. Dominic. He wasn't trying to rebuild himself this time. No, he was doing something far pettier, trying to dismantle me. I should have been furious. Instead, I laughed. The man had lost everything. And yet, even as he stood in the wreckage of his own making, he still thought he could bring me down. He had no idea who he was dealing with. The first direct strike came in the form of a fraud allegation. A reporter from a mid-tier financial blog reached out to Blackwell, claiming they had received an anonymous tip that I had manipulated contract negotiations with Winters Healthcare, one of our largest clients. They wanted a statement. I didn't give them one. Instead, I made a call. Catherine Winters answered after the second ring. I assume you've seen the article? I asked, skipping the pleasantries. A dry chuckle. Saw it before you did, I imagine. My legal team already sent a statement refuting every claim. I appreciate that. You should. She paused, then added, You know who did this, right? I leaned back in my chair. I have a very strong suspicion. Well, I hope your suspicion comes with a plan, because it's clear someone wants you gone. I smiled, slow and cold. Oh, I have a plan. The thing about revenge is that it requires patience. I let Dominic think he was making progress. Let him spread his lies, plant his seeds of doubt. I watched as he worked, desperate and pathetic, lashing out in the only way he knew how. Then, I buried him. It started with the funding trail. Dominic was broke, or at least he should have been. No job, no firm, no credibility. Yet somehow, he still had the resources to plant rumors, to nudge reporters in the right direction, to wine and dine the right people. So I followed the money. A quiet investigation, discreet inquiries. It didn't take long to uncover the truth. Dominic had a backer. And not just any backer, Arthur Franklin. I should have expected it. The two men who had underestimated me the most, now bound together by their mutual failures, grasping at whatever scraps of power they could still cling to. Arthur had always been a survivor. Even after Franklin and Associates collapsed, he had enough wealth and connections to land on his feet. But watching me rise while he faded into irrelevance, that must have been unbearable. So he had bankrolled Dominic's petty war against me, hoping to salvage what little dignity he had left by seeing me fall. They thought I wouldn't notice. They thought wrong. The reckoning came swiftly. I arranged a meeting with Arthur, choosing a high-profile restaurant where we were sure to be seen. He arrived looking weary, but composed, still clinging to the illusion that he was a man in control. You've been busy, I said as he sat across from me. Arthur sighed, rubbing his temples. Ruth, let's not do this. You funded Dominic, I cut in. I know it. You know it. Let's not insult each other by pretending otherwise. He stared at me for a long moment, then exhaled. You left me no choice. I tilted my head, amusement flickering through me. No choice? Arthur leaned forward, his voice low. You humiliated me. You took everything, Ruth. The firm, the clients, the legacy. I took nothing, I corrected, my tone cold. You lost it. You let it slip through your fingers. And now, instead of owning your failures, you're hiding behind Dominic, throwing stones from the shadows like a coward. His jaw clenched. I can still make things difficult for you, he warned. I smiled. No, Arthur, you can't. And then I slid a file across the table. Inside were documents I had compiled over the last month. Financial inconsistencies in Arthur's holdings, quiet but questionable deals, irregularities in how he had structured his exit from Franklin and Associates. I had always been thorough. Arthur paled as he flipped through the pages, his fingers tightening around the paper. I leaned in, my voice barely above a whisper. You have two choices. You disappear quietly, or you go down with Dominic. He swallowed hard, the weight of his own downfall settling over him. I stood, smoothing out my dress. You have 24 hours. Then I walked away, leaving him alone with the ruins of his own making. By the next morning, Arthur had liquidated his remaining assets and withdrawn from the industry completely. A public statement. Something about new ventures and private interests. A polite lie. He was done. And Dominic? His funding dried up overnight. His last remaining allies disappeared, distancing themselves from the stench of failure that clung to him. By the end of the week, he was bankrupt. And just like that, the two men who had tried to erase me were nothing. I sat in my office that evening, staring out at the city I now ruled. The war was over. I had won. And this time, there would be no one left to challenge me.